The winter of 1878 brought the most merciless blizzard the Dakota Territory had ever witnessed. Temperatures plummeted to bone-chilling lows as ferocious winds drove snow in impenetrable walls across the plains. It was in these brutal conditions that Abigail Winters found herself stranded in a modest schoolhouse, the town's schoolteacher now solely responsible for 5 orphaned children. Their supplies dwindled with each passing day, and hope faded with each howling gust that rattled the weathered windows. Abigail had resigned herself to their cruel fate until a shadow appeared at their door. A Sioux medicine woman named Wichapi, separated from her people in the storm, would make a discovery that would forever transform the lives of 6 desperate souls caught between 2 worlds. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Abigail Winters stared through the frost-covered window of the small schoolhouse, watching as the relentless snow continued to fall. Just 3 weeks earlier, her life had seemed full of promise. She had traveled west from Boston with idealistic dreams of bringing education to the frontier, accepting a position as the schoolteacher in the small settlement of Riversbend in the Dakota Territory. The town council had provided her with the modest schoolhouse that doubled as her living quarters, a simple one-room structure with a small, adjoining space where she slept. It wasn't much, but it had been enough for a young woman driven by purpose. But Riversbend had fallen on hard times. A devastating outbreak of scarlet fever had torn through the settlement just as winter approached, claiming nearly 20 lives, including the parents of 5 children who now had nowhere else to go. With the nearest orphanage over 100 miles away in Galveston, and the roads already becoming impassable with early snow, the town council had made a desperate decision. Abigail would care for the orphans temporarily in the schoolhouse until spring allowed for safe travel. She had agreed without hesitation, her compassionate nature not allowing her to consider any alternative. But none of them had anticipated the ferocity of the blizzard that descended just days after the remaining townspeople had departed for winter refuge with relatives in neighboring settlements. Now, as Abigail moved away from the window, she surveyed the 5 children huddled near the pot-bellied stove that provided their only heat. The oldest, 12-year-old Daniel Cooper, sat protectively beside his 8-year-old sister, Emma. The Taylor siblings, 10-year-old Samuel and 7-year-old Charlotte, leaned against each other, sharing a tattered blanket. And little Grace Harper, barely 6, clutched the rag doll that was her only remembrance of her mother. The sight of them tightened Abigail's chest with both fierce protectiveness and mounting despair. Their firewood supply was dwindling rapidly, and they had barely enough food to last another 5 days if she rationed carefully. The nearest trading post at Fort Madison was 20 miles away, an impossible journey on foot in these conditions, especially with 5 young children. "Miss Winters," Daniel's voice broke through her thoughts, "the fire's getting low again." "Thank you, Daniel," she replied, moving to add another precious log to the stove. She tried to mask her concern, knowing the children were watching her intently, drawing their courage from her example. Her body ached with exhaustion. She hadn't slept more than a few hours at a stretch since the blizzard began 3 days ago, constantly tending to the children or trying to maintain enough heat to keep them all from freezing. The storm showed no signs of abating. If anything, it had intensified overnight, with winds that threatened to tear the roof from above their heads. "Time for lessons," she announced, forcing brightness into her voice. Structure and routine, she had decided, were essential to maintaining a sense of normalcy and keeping fear at bay, both theirs and her own. The children gathered around the small table they used as desks during school hours. Even in their dire circumstances, Abigail insisted on continuing their education. It distracted them from their hunger and the howling storm outside, and it distracted her from the grim calculations she made each night after they had fallen asleep. "Today, we'll practice our arithmetic, and then I'll read another chapter from Treasure Island," she told them, distributing the precious few slates and chalk sticks they had. The library consisted of only a dozen books she had brought from Boston, but they had been reading them over and over, finding comfort in the familiar stories. As the children worked on their sums, Abigail quietly inventoried their supplies once more. The root cellar beneath the schoolhouse had contained a modest storage of potatoes, carrots, and preserves that had sustained them thus far, but those provisions were nearly exhausted. The last of their salted pork would be gone after tonight's meager stew. She had sent a letter to Fort Madison before the worst of the snow had arrived, but even in good conditions, mail took weeks to reach its destination. No help would come from that direction in time. As night fell, the temperature dropped even further. Abigail added the last substantial log to the stove, leaving only a handful of small branches and kindling. She would have to start breaking up the benches and desks soon if they were to survive another day. The children bedded down on pallets around the stove, huddled together for warmth beneath every blanket and article of clothing that could be spared. Abigail read to them until they fell asleep, her voice weaving tales of adventure and courage that seemed far removed from their desperate reality. When she was certain they slumbered, Abigail allowed the brave facade to slip. A single tear traced down her cheek as she confronted the terrible truth. Without help, they would not survive another week. Miles away across the snow-covered plains, Wichapi trudged forward against the punishing wind, grateful for the knowledge that had kept her alive for 2 days in the open, during the worst blizzard she had witnessed in her 46 winters. She hadn't intended to venture this far from her people's winter camp, but the vision that came to her during a healing ceremony had been powerful and undeniable. Wichapi, whose name meant star in the Lakota language, was a respected medicine woman among her band of Hunkpapa Sioux. The daughter of a healer, she had shown signs of her calling from childhood, demonstrating an uncanny ability to find medicinal plants and an intuitive understanding of sickness and healing that went beyond her mother's teachings. Now, wrapped in layers of rabbit fur and buffalo hide, with snowshoes crafted from willow and sinew strapped to her feet, she followed what the elders called the pulling of the spirit, an instinct beyond explanation that drew her through the blinding snow toward something she could not yet name. The storm had separated her from her 2 companions during what was meant to be a short journey to gather specific roots that only grew on the north-facing slopes of the hills that bordered their winter encampment. The others had turned back when the sky darkened ominously, but Wichapi had continued, driven by a certainty she could not articulate even to herself. By the 3rd day in the storm, Wichapi's instincts told her she was close to whatever had called her from her people. The wind had shifted slightly, and though snow still fell heavily, the howling had diminished. She had survived by creating temporary snow shelters each night, using techniques passed down through generations, and by carrying pemmican and dried berries that provided sustenance when hunting was impossible. As dawn broke on the 4th day, Wichapi emerged from her shelter. The snow had finally stopped, though the sky remained threatening. She adjusted her pack containing her precious medicines and continued forward, her experienced eyes constantly scanning the harsh white landscape for landmarks or signs of life. She had traveled perhaps 3 miles when she noticed something unusual in the distance, a square shape against the undulating snow, too regular to be natural. Wichapi paused, squinting against the glare. A building of some kind stood where no Sioux would build, which meant it belonged to the white settlers. Wichapi hesitated. Relations between her people and the white settlers were complex and often dangerous. The great conflict that the whites called Custer's Last Stand, had occurred just 2 years prior, and though her band had not participated directly, all Sioux were viewed with suspicion and hostility by many settlers. However, something about this isolated structure pulled at her senses. There was a faintness in the air, barely perceptible wisps of smoke that suggested a dying fire within. Someone was inside, and they were in trouble. Wichapi deliberated only briefly. The winter cold killed without discrimination, and her peoples ways taught that withholding help from those in need, even strangers, even potential enemies, revealed a poverty of spirit. She moved forward cautiously, approaching the strange square building that she now recognized as one of the white people's schoolhouses. She had seen something similar when her band had traded near Fort Madison the previous spring. As she drew closer, Wichapi circled the structure once, noting there were no tracks in the snow. No one had gone in or out for days. The chimney emitted only the faintest trace of smoke, suggesting the fire inside was nearly extinguished. A sense of urgency quickened her steps. Inside the schoolhouse, Abigail startled at the sound of footsteps crunching in the snow outside. Her heart raced with both hope and fear. Visitors could mean salvation, but this was still frontier country, where danger often arrived uninvited. She moved to check on the children, who remained asleep, exhausted from days of cold and hunger. Then she reached for the rifle that one of the council members had insisted she keep by the door, though she doubted her ability to use it effectively if needed. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice weak from disuse and rationed water. The footsteps stopped directly outside the door, followed by a moment of silence that stretched Abigail's nerves to the breaking point. Then came a light knock. "Hello inside," called a female voice with an accent Abigail couldn't immediately place. "I come in peace." Abigail hesitated, her hand still on the rifle. The children began to stir at the sound of the unfamiliar voice. "I'm opening the door," she announced, fumbling with the frozen latch. When the door swung open, Abigail found herself face to face with a woman unlike any she had encountered before. She was not tall, but her presence seemed to fill the doorway nonetheless. She wore layers of animal hides adorned with intricate beadwork, and her dark hair, streaked with grey, was braided with small decorative shells and bones. Snowshoes were strapped to her feet, and she carried a pack on her back. Most striking were her eyes, dark, penetrating, and filled with an intelligence that seemed to look straight through to Abigail's soul. Taking in the scene before her with rapid assessment, Wichapi immediately understood the situation. The white woman was clearly exhausted, her face gaunt, and her clothes hanging loosely on her frame. Behind her, Wichapi could see 5 children beginning to rouse from sleep near a stove that contained only glowing embers. The schoolhouse was dangerously cold, the air inside barely warmer than the frozen world outside. "I am Wichapi," she said, keeping her voice gentle and her hands visible, remembering the fear whites often showed toward her people. "The storm separated me from my people. You need help." Abigail stared at her, swaying slightly from fatigue. "I'm Abigail Winters, the school teacher," she finally responded. "These children, their parents died. We're nearly out of wood and food." Her voice broke on the last word, the admission of their desperate straits seeming to drain what little energy she had left. Wichapi nodded solemnly. "May I enter? I can help." Abigail stepped back, allowing her entry. As Wichapi moved into the schoolhouse, she immediately assessed the dire situation: the nearly empty woodbox beside the stove, the thin pallets where the children slept, the shelves that contained only a few cans and a small sack of cornmeal. This woman and these children would not have survived another day without intervention. The oldest boy had placed himself protectively in front of the younger children, his stance wary, but his eyes revealing a desperate hope. "First, we need fire," Wichapi said matter-of-factly, setting down her pack. "Then food. I have skills for both." Abigail watched, as the stranger efficiently rebuilt the dying fire in the stove, adding small pieces of kindling from a pouch at her waist before retrieving an axe she spotted in the corner. Without another word, Wichapi went outside. Minutes later, Abigail heard the sound of chopping. When Wichapi returned, her arms were laden with wood from a pine tree she had felled nearby. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "This will burn well enough," she explained, arranging the logs by the stove. "Not ideal, but better than freezing. I have pemmican as well, dried meat mixed with fat and berries. Very nourishing." Abigail felt tears welling in her eyes. The first she had allowed herself since the blizzard began. "Thank you," she whispered. "I don't know how to repay you." Wichapi shook her head. "No payment is necessary. No one survives alone in such conditions." She glanced at the children who were now fully awake and watching her with a mixture of fear and fascination. "How many winters have they seen?" "Daniel is 12, Abigail replied, indicating the oldest boy. "Emma is 8, Samuel is 10, Charlotte is 7, and little Grace is 6. Wichapi nodded thoughtfully. "The storm has passed, but danger remains. Fort Madison is too far to travel with children in these conditions." She hesitated before continuing. "My people's winter camp is a day's journey from here. They would welcome you until safer travel is possible." Abigail looked up in surprise. "Your people?" "I am Hunkpapa Sioux," Wichapi explained. "Our winter. Our camp has 27 lodges this season, sheltered in the river valley, where the winds are less fierce." She paused. "The choice is yours, but you and the children would be safe there." Abigail looked around the cold schoolhouse at the meager supplies, and then at the vulnerable children who depended on her. She thought of the impossible journey to Fort Madison, and the weeks it would take for any response to her letter to arrive. If it arrived at all, would they truly accept us? She asked quietly. "They would," Wichapi assured her. "My people value children above all else, and my position as a medicine woman will ensure your safety." She looked directly into Abigail's eyes. "I cannot in good conscience leave you here, but I will respect whatever decision you make." As night fell again, Abigail sat by the replenished fire, watching as Wichapi efficiently prepared a stew from the pemmican she had brought, supplemented with the last of their potatoes. The schoolhouse was warmer now, and for the first time in days she felt a small flicker of hope. The children, initially wary of the stranger, had been won over when Wichapi produced 5 small carved wooden animals from her pack, a gift that seemed magical in their eyes. Now they sat close to her, listening intently as she told them a story about a clever rabbit that outsmarted a hunter. Even Daniel, the most protective and suspicious, had edged closer, unable to resist the pull of her storytelling. "We leave at first light," Wichapi instructed when the tale was finished. "Sleep now, the journey will be demanding." Abigail nodded, exhaustion settling over her despite her anxiety about their departure. She checked on each child one last time before lying down on her own pallet, wondering what awaited them at the Sioux winter camp. The alternative, however, was unthinkable. As she drifted towards sleep, she found herself grateful for the strange twist of fate that had brought Wichapi to their door just when all hope seemed lost. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they had been granted the most precious gift of all, a second chance. Morning arrived with temperatures even lower than the previous day, though the sky had cleared to a brilliant blue. Abigail dressed the children in multiple layers, ensuring each had their warmest clothes. Little Grace struggled with her mittens until Wichapi knelt beside her, showing her a special way to tuck her thumbs that would keep them warmer. "The sun is bright, but do not be fooled," Wichapi cautioned as they prepared to leave. "Winter still has sharp teeth today." Outside, the landscape stretched white and endless in every direction. The sun had just cleared the eastern horizon, casting long blue shadows across the snow. Whichapi had fashioned a travois from branches and the schoolhouse's small blackboard, creating a sled-like conveyance that the smallest children could ride. On when they tired, walk in my tracks when possible, she instructed, securing a rope around her waist that connected to Abigail, who would lead the older children. If anyone grows too cold, tell me immediately. With that, their unlikely procession began moving across the snow-covered plains, leaving behind the schoolhouse that had been both refuge and prison during the blizzard's fury. As they traveled, Abigail found herself reflecting on the path that had led her to this moment. Growing up in Boston as the daughter of a university professor, she had been afforded educational opportunities uncommon for young women of her generation. Her father, unlike many men of his era, believed firmly in women's intellectual capacities and had encouraged her studies in literature, mathematics, and sciences. "Your mind is a gift, Abigail," he had often told her. "Use it to improve not just your own condition, but the condition of others." When her parents died within months of each other, her mother from influenza and her father from what the doctors called a broken heart, Abigail found herself alone at 22, with a modest inheritance and an uncertain future. Boston, with its bitter memories and rapidly changing social landscape, felt suddenly confining. The advertisement in the Boston Herald had seemed like Providence itself speaking to her. "School teacher wanted, Dakota Territory, single woman preferred. Room and board provided, bring civilization to the frontier." The town council of Riversbend had responded enthusiastically to her application, impressed by her educational credentials and perhaps more importantly, by her willingness to venture so far west. Their letters had painted Riversbend as a growing settlement with nearly 30 families poised to become an important waypoint between Fort Madison and the larger town of Galveston. What the letters hadn't conveyed was the settlement's precarious position. Economically dependent on cattle drives that had recently been rerouted, geographically isolated during the harsh winter months, and demographically vulnerable with so many young families susceptible to disease. "You're thinking deeply," Whichapi observed, interrupting Abigail's reflections as they paused for a brief rest near a stand of snow-covered pines. The children were sharing strips of dried meat that the medicine woman had provided, their initial hesitation about the unfamiliar food forgotten in the face of genuine hunger. "About how I came to be here," Abigail admitted. "The path seems so clear in retrospect, yet I never imagined—" "The Great Spirit places us where we are needed," Whichapi replied, her gaze moving to the children. "These little ones needed you. Now you need me. Tomorrow, who knows what pattern the blanket will reveal." Before Abigail could respond, Daniel approached, his natural leadership asserting itself even in these extraordinary circumstances. "Miss Winters," he began formally, then hesitated. "The girls are getting tired. Samuel too, though he won't admit it." Whichapi nodded, unsurprised. "We will use the travois now. The small ones can ride while you and I pull." As they arranged the younger children on the makeshift sled, Abigail observed the easy competence with which Whichapi addressed every challenge. There was a quiet confidence in her movements that spoke of a lifetime of practical knowledge that had likely been passed down through many generations. "How did you become separated from your people?" Abigail asked, as they resumed their journey, now pulling the travois between them, while Daniel walked alongside, occasionally helping to push when they encountered deeper snow. Whichapi was silent for several steps, as if considering how much to share. "I am a medicine woman," she finally replied. "I was gathering roots that grow only on certain hillsides, plants that heal coughs and fevers. When the storm came, I was far from camp. My companions turned back, but I felt—" She paused, searching for the right word, A pulling, something calling me to continue. A pulling? Abigail echoed, uncertain of her meaning. My grandmother had this gift also, Wichapi explained. Sometimes the spirit world guides our steps when someone is in need of healing. I have learned to listen when this happens. Abigail pondered this as they trudged forward. Her own upbringing had been steeped in rational thought and Protestant Christianity, a world where spiritual pullings were viewed with skepticism, if not outright dismissal. Yet here she was, alive with 5 children, because this woman had followed precisely. Such an intuition. Were you always a healer, she asked, genuinely curious. A faint smile crossed Wichapi's face. Since I was younger than little Grace, my mother saw the signs early, how animals would come to me without fear, how I could find healing plants even when covered by snow. She glanced at Abigail. Your people would say I had a calling. Mine say I was chosen by the spirits. Their conversation was interrupted as Emma called out excitedly from the travois, pointing to a distant movement on the horizon. Look, animals! Wichapi followed her gaze and nodded. Buffalo, a small herd. They are far from us. Nothing to fear. Real. Buffalo! Samuel exclaimed, momentarily forgetting his exhaustion. We learned about them in lessons, but I've never seen one. They were once everywhere, Wichapi said, a shadow passing across her features. When I was a girl, the herds were so vast they took days to pass. Now they grow fewer each year as white hunters kill them. An uncomfortable silence fell. Abigail noted how Daniel's posture stiffened slightly at the implied criticism, his young mind already absorbing the complex tensions between the two cultures they were bridging. Perhaps you can teach us about the buffalo, Abigail suggested diplomatically. Their importance to your people. Wichapi seemed to appreciate the gesture. As they continued their journey, she shared stories of how the buffalo provided nearly everything her people needed. Meat for food, hides for teepees and clothing, bones for tools, sinew for thread, bladders for water containers. The children listened with rapt attention, particularly when she described the elaborate buffalo hunts of earlier days, when her people had still roamed freely across the plains, following the great herds. By midday, they had made good progress despite the challenging conditions. The landscape had begun to change subtly, with more trees appearing and the terrain becoming less flat as they approached a series of low hills. Wichapi pointed to a distant line of darker growth. The river valley lies beyond those hills. Our winter camp is there, sheltered from the worst winds, with good water and wood nearby. They paused for another rest, the children now showing clear signs of fatigue despite their determination. Charlotte had fallen asleep on the travois, while Grace was struggling to keep her eyes open. Even Daniel's resolute stride had faltered, though he refused to complain. As Abigail distributed the last of their water, she found herself studying Wichapi more carefully. The medicine woman appeared to be in her mid-40s, with strands of grey in her dark braids, yet she moved with the energy and endurance of someone far younger. Her face bore the lines of someone who spent much time outdoors, but her skin had a healthy glow that spoke of good nutrition and vitality. Most striking was the evident respect she showed the children, addressing even little Grace with the same dignity she afforded Abigail. This was not the behavior of a savage, as frontier newspapers often characterized the native peoples. There was wisdom here, and compassion that challenged everything Abigail had been led to believe. We should continue, Wichapi announced after, ensuring everyone had rested. The day grows short, and we must reach the valley before darkness. As they resumed their journey, Abigail's thoughts turned to the orphans in her care, each with their own story of loss and resilience. Daniel and Emma Cooper had lost their father 2 years earlier when his horse had thrown him during a thunderstorm. Their mother had managed to keep their small farm functioning until the fever took her just weeks ago. Daniel, at 12, had already developed the serious demeanor of someone forced to assume adult responsibilities too soon. He watched over his sister with fierce protectiveness, and Abigail had noticed how he tried to help with the younger children as well, as if attempting to shoulder burdens beyond his years. Emma, by contrast, still retained a child's curiosity and enthusiasm despite her losses. She collected interesting rocks and feathers, wrote simple poems in her school notebook, and often spoke of becoming a teacher herself someday, just like Miss Winters. Her resilience both heartened and concerned Abigail, who wondered if the girl had truly processed her grief or simply buried it beneath a cheerful exterior. The Taylor siblings, Samuel and Charlotte, had a different story. Their father had been Rivers Bend's blacksmith, a skilled craftsman whose work had been sought after throughout the territory. Their mother, according to town gossip, had abandoned the family the previous spring, running off with a cattle driver passing through the region. Mr. Taylor had struggled to care for his children while maintaining his business, often leaving them in the care of neighbors. When the fever claimed him, the children had seemed almost unsurprised by this latest abandonment, as if expecting that all adults would eventually leave them. Samuel channeled his feelings into constant motion and occasional mischief, challenging Abigail's patience in the classroom, but showing remarkable aptitude for mechanical concepts. Charlotte, more withdrawn, found comfort in drawing and often disappeared into elaborate fantasy worlds of her own creation, populating her slate with tiny, detailed figures that told stories she rarely shared aloud. And then there was Grace Harper, the youngest at 6. Her story was perhaps the most heartbreaking. Both parents had succumbed to the fever within days of each other, leaving her utterly alone, an only child with no relatives in the territory. In the weeks since, she had spoken very little, clinging to her rag doll and following Abigail like a shadow. Only at night did her grief emerge fully in the form of quiet sobs that she tried to muffle in her blanket. 5 children, each carrying invisible wounds alongside their visible needs for food, shelter and guidance. Abigail had committed to protecting them when the town council departed, but now, trudging through knee-deep snow toward an unknown reception at a Sioux camp, she questioned whether she had made the right choice in accepting Wichapi's offer. "You." "A doubt," Wichapi said quietly, accurately reading Abigail's expression. "This is natural. You journey to a place you do not know, among people you have been taught to fear." "It's not that," Abigail protested, though in truth, it was partly that. "I worry about the children. They've already lost so much. If your people reject us, they will not," Wichapi stated with simple certainty. "Our ways require hospitality to those in need, especially children." She gestured toward the darkening sky. "And no one would turn away travelers in winter. This would be a great dishonor." They continued in silence for a time, each lost in thought as the terrain gradually became more wooded. The snow was less deep here, sheltered by the trees, making their progress somewhat easier. The children had grown mostly quiet, conserving their energy for the journey. As afternoon waned toward evening, they crested a final hill, and Wichapi paused, allowing Abigail and the children to catch up. "Look," she said simply, gesturing ahead. Below them stretched a sheltered valley. A small river, partially frozen but still flowing in the center, curved through stands of cottonwood and pine. And there, arranged in a loose circle near the water, stood 24 conical structures. Teepees, Abigail realized, each with smoke rising from openings at their peaks. "Your people," she murmured, suddenly acutely aware of her status as an outsider. "They have seen us," Wichapi noted, pointing to a group of figures who had emerged from the camp and were now heading in their direction. "Do not be afraid. They come to assist us." Abigail straightened her shoulders, summoning her courage. "Children," she said, turning to the 5 weary youngsters, "remember your manners. We are guests here." Daniel nodded solemnly, while the others looked too exhausted to register much beyond the promise of warmth and rest that the camp represented. As the figures drew closer, Abigail could see that the group consisted of 3 men and 2 women, all bundled in winter furs. Their faces, initially wary, showed visible relief when they recognized Wichapi. A rapid conversation in the Lakota language followed, with frequent glances toward Abigail and the children. Finally, one of the men, older than the others, with dignity evident in his bearing, stepped forward and addressed Abigail directly. In halting but understandable English, "I am Chief Red Cloud. Wichapi tells us you were trapped in the great storm with these little ones. You are welcome in our camp." Abigail inclined her head respectfully. "Thank you for allowing us to come. I'm Abigail Winters, the schoolteacher from Rivers Bend. These children and I would not have survived without Wichapi's help." The chief studied her face for a long moment before nodding. "The Lakota do not turn away those in need, especially children." He gestured to the others who had come with him. "We will help you to the camp. My wife prepares a place for you." The final stretch to the camp passed in a blur for Abigail. 2 of the men took over pulling the travois, moving with practiced efficiency through the snow. One of the women walked alongside Abigail, occasionally steadying her when she stumbled with fatigue. Wichapi led the way, exchanging greetings with people who emerged from tipis as they approached. The reactions of the camp's inhabitants ranged from open curiosity to guarded observation, but Abigail detected no hostility, a relief given her uncertain expectations. Children, particularly, seemed fascinated by the newcomers, pointing and calling out questions that Wichapi answered patiently. They were led to a large teepee near the center of the camp. Outside stood an older woman with a deeply lined face and keen eyes that immediately reminded Abigail of Wichapi, though they appeared close in age rather than representing different generations. "My sister, Hanmani," Wichapi introduced as they stopped before her. "She has prepared a place for you." Hanmani's gaze moved directly to the children, her weathered face softening as she looked at them. She said something that made Wichapi smile. "She says they have strong spirits to have traveled so far in the cold. She welcomes them and you to share her lodge." As Abigail followed Hanmani into the teepee, helping the exhausted children inside, she felt a curious sense of crossing a threshold. In more ways than one, behind her lay the life she had envisioned as Rivers Bend's respectable schoolteacher. Ahead lay an unknown path, beginning with these people who had offered shelter when there was nowhere else to turn. Inside the teepee, a fire burned in a central pit, smoke rising to escape through the opening at the peak. Furs and woven mats covered the ground, creating a surprisingly comfortable and warm space. Hanmani gestured to a prepared area, with extra furs and blankets clearly arranged in anticipation of their arrival. "This will be your place," Wichapi explained. "My sister sleeps there." She pointed to the opposite side of the fire. "I will stay with my daughter's family while you are here." The children, beyond exhaustion, settled onto the furs. Within moments, Charlotte, Grace, and Emma had fallen asleep. Samuel fought to keep his eyes open a little longer, curiosity temporarily overcoming fatigue, while Daniel maintained his vigilant watch despite his obvious exhaustion. Hanmani handed Abigail a wooden bowl filled with a rich stew of meat and wild roots. The aroma made her stomach rumble, reminding her how long it had been since they'd eaten properly. As she accepted the food with murmured thanks, Abigail realized that for the first time in many days, the knot of fear in her chest had begun to loosen. They were safe, at least for now. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but tonight, they had shelter, food, and the unexpected kindness of strangers who, despite every cultural difference, had welcomed them without hesitation. As night settled fully over the camp, Abigail watched the children sleeping peacefully around the fire. Daniel had finally succumbed to exhaustion. His protective instincts temporarily surrendered to the body's demands. In sleep, they looked so vulnerable, so deserving of better than the harsh hand fate had dealt them. "Rest now," Wichapi said quietly, noticing Abigail's struggle to keep her eyes open. "You are safe here." Abigail needed no further encouragement. She checked each child once more, then lay down beside them, pulling a soft buffalo hide over herself. Just before sleep claimed her, a thought surfaced from the depths of her exhaustion. They had traveled far from everything familiar, yet somehow found themselves exactly where they needed to be. Abigail awoke to unfamiliar sounds, soft voices speaking in a language she didn't understand, the crackling of a fire, and the gentle rustling of movement around her. For a disorienting moment, she couldn't remember where she was. Then reality rushed back as she felt a small hand patting her face. "Miss Winters, wake up," Grace whispered urgently. "There's a baby deer inside this house." Sitting up quickly, Abigail found herself gazing at what was indeed a young fawn, standing tentatively near the teepee entrance while a Sioux woman, not Hanmani, but someone younger, tended to it, dabbing something on its leg with gentle motions. Wichapi entered the teepee just as Abigail was trying to make sense of the scene. "Good morning," she greeted, noticing Abigail and Grace's confused expressions. "I see you've met my niece, Zitkalasa, and her patient." "There's a deer in the house," Abigail managed, still adjusting to the reality of their situation. Wichapi nodded, settling beside them. "Zitkalasa follows the healing path, as I do. She found this fawn with an injured leg. She treats it until it can return to its mother, who waits in the woods nearby." She spoke briefly to her niece in Lakota, then turned back to Abigail. "The children slept well. The others are already outside, curious about everything. Indeed, the other 4 children's sleeping furs were empty." Abigail felt a momentary panic at not knowing their whereabouts, quickly followed by embarrassment. At her reaction, these people had saved them. There was no reason to fear for the children's safety now. Sensing her concern, Wichapi added, "Daniel watches over them. They help bring water from the river under Hanmani's guidance. It is good for them to have tasks." Grace continued staring at the fawn, clearly fascinated. "Can I touch it?" she asked shyly, directing her question to Zitkalasa despite the language barrier. The young woman looked up, her expression softening. Though she didn't understand the words, the child's intent was clear. She beckoned Grace forward with a gentle motion, then demonstrated how to approach the fawn slowly, with an open palm extended. When Grace successfully stroked the fawn's neck, her face transformed with wonder, the first truly joyful expression Abigail had seen from the girl since the fever had claimed her parents. "Pila Maya," Wichapi said to her niece. Then to Grace, "That means thank you in our language." "Pila Maya," Grace attempted, looking to Wichapi for approval. "Good," Wichapi nodded. "The first bridge between peoples is always words." She turned to Abigail. "Are you hungry? The morning meal awaits." Outside, the winter camp was fully awake and bustling with activity. Women worked at cooking fires or scraped hides stretched on frames. Men repaired tools and weapons or gathered in small groups, discussing matters Abigail couldn't understand. Children darted between teepees in what appeared to be an elaborate game of chase, their laughter creating puffs of vapor in the cold air. Abigail spotted her charges immediately. Daniel and Samuel were carrying water skins from the river under the watchful eye of an elderly man, while Emma and Charlotte helped Hanmani sort dried berries into various containers. The temperature had risen slightly overnight, making the day more bearable than the previous one. Still, everyone wore layers of fur and hide clothing, their breath visible in the crisp morning air. The camp was situated to take advantage of natural windbreaks, with the teepees arranged in a pattern that Abigail suspected was both practical and traditional. Wichapi led her to a communal cooking area where several women tended multiple pots. They greeted Wichapi with obvious respect and regarded Abigail with curious but not unfriendly glances. "You must eat," Whichappie said, handing Abigail a wooden bowl filled with a porridge-like mixture. "This will give strength, made from wild rice, dried berries, and nuts." The food was unfamiliar but delicious, nutty and slightly sweet, with chewy bits that provided a satisfying texture. Abigail hadn't realized how hungry she was until the first spoonful touched her lips. She ate quickly, suddenly ravenous after their arduous journey. As she finished, Chief Red Cloud approached, his bearing dignified but his expression open. "Teacher from Boston," he greeted her. "Did you rest well?" "Yes, thank you," Abigail replied, momentarily surprised he knew her origin. "Whichappie told you I'm from Boston." A slight smile crossed his weathered face. "Many seasons ago, I traveled east with a delegation to Washington. Our train stopped in Boston. I remember tall buildings, many boats." He paused, his expression growing more serious. "Today, council meets. We discuss many things, including your staying time. You will attend." It wasn't a question, but Abigail nodded her understanding. "Of course, the children will learn," Red Cloud finished for her. "Hanmani and others will show them our ways while council speaks. This is a good exchange. Your children teach our children some English words. Our children teach yours how to stay warm, find food in winter." Before Abigail could respond, Emma and Charlotte ran up, their eyes bright with excitement. "Miss Winters," Emma exclaimed, "we're learning to make pemmican. It's meat and berries all mixed together." And Hanmani showed us how to identify different tracks in the snow, Charlotte added, her usual reserve momentarily forgotten. "We saw rabbit and fox prints near the edge of camp." Abigail felt a surge of gratitude at seeing the girls so animated. After weeks of grief and the terror of the blizzard, they were responding to new experiences with a child's natural resilience. "That's wonderful," she told them. "Where are the others?" "Daniel and Samuel are learning to check fishing lines under the ice," Charlotte replied. "Grace is still inside with the baby deer. She hasn't stopped smiling since she touched it." After ensuring the children were settled with their various activities, Abigail followed Whichappie to the council meeting. They entered the largest teepee in the camp, where about 15 people, both men and women, were already seated in a circle around a central fire. Chief Red Cloud occupied a place of honor, his expression solemn as they entered. Whichappie indicated where Abigail should sit, then took a position slightly behind her. The proceedings began with what Abigail assumed were ceremonial words spoken by Red Cloud in Lakota. A pipe was passed around the circle, though Whichappie whispered that Abigail was not expected to participate in this ritual. Finally, Red Cloud addressed her directly in his accented English. "Woman teacher who came with Whichappie, tell us your story. How you came to be alone with children in the great storm." Taking a deep breath, conscious of all eyes upon her, Abigail began to speak. She explained her journey from Boston, her position in River's Bend, and the fever that had orphaned the children in her care. She described how the town council had departed, promising to return in spring, leaving her to care for the orphans through the winter. "If Whichappie hadn't found us when she did, we would have died," she concluded simply. "I owe her the lives of 5 children, and my own as well." After Whichappie translated her words for those who didn't understand English, a thoughtful silence fell over the gathering. Finally, one of the older men spoke, his words directed at Red Cloud. He asks how long before your people come looking for you. Whichappie translated quietly for Abigail. Not until spring thaw, Abigail replied. The town council knows we were well provisioned for winter. They won't expect travel to be possible before April, maybe even May, depending on the weather. Another council member, a woman with intricate beadwork adorning her dress, spoke next. Whichappie listened before translating. Singing. Bird asks about the children's health. Were any sick with the fever that took their parents? No, Abigail replied, turning toward the woman. They've all remained healthy, thankfully. My primary concern has been keeping them warm enough and ensuring adequate nutrition, especially after our supplies began to dwindle. A brief discussion followed in Lakota, with several council members speaking in turn. Wichapi periodically translated the general points for Abigail's benefit. They are discussing how to best help the children through the winter months, she explained. Some suggest teaching them our ways of finding food even in the coldest times. Others emphasize the importance of proper clothing. Your white man's fabrics are not sufficient for Dakota winters. Chief Red Cloud raised a hand, silencing the discussion. He addressed Abigail directly again. You and children may stay until spring makes travel safe. Wichapi speaks for you, which means her honor is bound to yours, while here you will learn our ways and contribute as you are able. His gaze was penetrating but not unkind. Do you accept these terms? I do, with gratitude, Abigail replied, inclining her head respectfully. We'll work hard and try to learn quickly. After a few more ceremonial words, the council adjourned. As people began to disperse, several women approached Abigail, their initial reserve giving way to practical concerns and questions, which Wichapi translated. They want to know if the children have proper winter moccasins. The boots white children wear do not keep feet warm enough. They're asking if you can sew or cook. Each person in camp contributes to survival. This is Singing Bird. She lost a granddaughter to fever 2 winters ago. She asks if she might sometimes teach little Grace traditional stories. Abigail answered each question as best she could, touched by the women's practical concern for her children's welfare. By the time they left the council teepee, she felt a tentative connection beginning to form, not friendship exactly, but a mutual recognition of shared concerns for the well-being of children, regardless of their different origins. The following days established a rhythm unlike anything Abigail had previously experienced. Each morning began before dawn, with every member of the camp rising to perform specific tasks essential to the community's survival. The children were gradually integrated into age-appropriate activities. Daniel, as the oldest, joined the young men checking fishing lines and snares for rabbits. His initial reluctance gave way to pride when he caught his first fish through the ice, earning praise from his Lakota mentors. Samuel, with his mechanical aptitude, found himself drawn to an elderly craftsman who specialized in creating tools from bone, wood, and stone. Despite the language barrier, the two developed a system of demonstration and imitation that proved remarkably effective. Emma and Charlotte divided their time between learning traditional beadwork from the women and helping gather the inner bark of certain trees that could be ground into an emergency flour when other food was scarce. Both girls proved quick studies, with Emma particularly excelling at the intricate bead patterns. Little Grace, still the most vulnerable emotionally, formed a special bond with Singing Bird, who showed infinite patience with the child's questions and hesitant attempts to learn Lakota words. Under the older woman's gentle guidance, Grace began to emerge from her shell, especially when involved in caring for the young animals that Zitkalasa treated. For Abigail, the learning curve was steepest of all. Having relied on store-bought supplies and relatively modern conveniences, even in Rivers Bend, she found herself humbled by how much she didn't know about basic survival. The fire is smoking too much, Wichapi observed on their third morning, watching as Abigail struggled to maintain the flame in Hanmani's tipi. You use 2 green wood. Here, let me show you. With practiced movements, Wichapi demonstrated how to select and arrange the wood for optimal burning. See? The driest pieces. At the bottom, arrange to allow air. Then gradually add larger pieces. This creates heat with less smoke. It was a small lesson, but representative of dozens of similar moments where Abigail found herself receiving instruction in skills her formal education had never addressed. How to identify which plants remained edible under snow, how to predict weather changes by observing animal behavior, how to preserve food without salt, how to treat minor frostbite using pine resin and certain herbs. "I feel like a child again," she confessed to Wichapi one evening as they worked together scraping a deer hide. "Learning the most basic things I should already know. Yet you know many things we do not," Wichapi replied thoughtfully. "I have watched you teaching your children. Numbers, writing, stories from your books. These are different kinds of knowledge, but no less valuable." This exchange sparked an idea in Abigail's mind. The next day, she approached Chief Red Cloud with a proposal which Wichapi helped translate. "I've been thinking about how I might contribute more to the camp while we're here," she began. "Would it be acceptable if I offered to teach basic English to anyone interested? It might be useful for trading or dealing with officials at the Sioux fort." Red Cloud considered this carefully before responding. "This is good. Knowledge of the white man's tongue helps protect our people when we must deal with Indian agents or soldiers." He paused. "In exchange, perhaps you would like to learn more of our language as well." And so, as January progressed, Abigail found herself conducting impromptu English lessons each afternoon in Hanmani's teepee. The classes began with just a few curious teenagers, but soon expanded to include younger children and several adults, including Red Cloud himself. In the evenings, she and the orphans received instruction in Lakota from Singing Bird and others, creating a reciprocal exchange that benefited both communities. This cultural bridge building extended beyond language. During a particularly harsh, cold snap, when outdoor activities were limited, Abigail introduced the Lakota children to simple arithmetic using pebbles and sticks as counters. In return, Hanmani taught Abigail and her charges traditional string games that developed finger dexterity while illustrating Lakota stories and concepts. Food preparation became another area of knowledge exchange. Abigail demonstrated how to make cornbread using the camp's limited supplies, while the Sioux women showed her numerous ways to prepare game meat, including a stew with wild turnips that became a favorite with all 5 orphans. The most significant moment of cultural exchange occurred about 2 weeks after their arrival, when a successful hunting party returned with 2 deer and a small buffalo they had managed to separate from its herd. The entire camp erupted in celebration at this windfall of fresh meat during the lean winter months. Abigail and the children watched in fascination as the butchering process began, a highly organized activity where nothing was wasted. Meat was cut into specific portions for immediate cooking or preservation. Hides were carefully removed for later tanning. Bones were separated according to their most useful applications, some for tools, others for boiling into nutritious broth. "Every part has purpose," Wichapi explained as they observed. "The eyes, brain, organs, all food. The tendons become sinew for sewing. Even the stomach can be cleaned and used to carry water." Daniel, who had been permitted to observe the hunter's work closely, returned to Abigail with wide eyes. "Miss Winters, they thank the animal's spirits before they begin cutting. They say it honors the sacrifice that allows us to live." His tone held no mockery, only a thoughtful consideration of a concept entirely new to him. Abigail realized that the children were absorbing not just survival skills, but an entirely different way of viewing their relationship with the natural world. As January gave way to February, physical transformations became evident in all of them. The children's faces, initially pale and drawn from their ordeal, had taken on a healthy glow from outdoor activity and proper nutrition. They moved with greater confidence through deep snow, no longer floundering as they had during their journey to the camp. Abigail noticed changes in herself as well. Her hands, once soft from indoor teaching, had toughened from practical work. Her sense of smell seemed more acute, allowing her to distinguish subtle differences in plants that looked nearly identical. Most significantly, she found herself increasingly able to navigate by natural landmarks rather than relying on the artificial grid of streets and buildings that had oriented her previous life. One crisp February morning, Wichapi invited Abigail to join her on a special expedition. "Today I teach you medicine plants that sleep under snow," she explained, "knowledge a woman with children should have." They left the camp at dawn, snowshoes, strapped to their feet, with Hanmani watching over the 5 orphans. Wichapi led them to a south-facing slope where the snow was thinner, sheltered by an outcropping of rock. "Watch how I find them," she instructed, kneeling and carefully brushing away snow in specific locations. "See this pattern of dead stalks? Below, the roots wait for spring. These treat fever." She demonstrated how to carefully extract what was needed without destroying the plant's ability to regrow. Throughout the morning, Wichapi identified over a dozen plants that retained medicinal properties even in winter. Roots for treating coughs, bark for pain relief, evergreen needles rich in vitamins that prevented winter sickness. As they worked, Abigail found herself sharing more of her own story, her parents' deaths, her decision to come west, her philosophies of education. Wichapi listened attentively, asking occasional questions that revealed a genuine interest in understanding. "Abigail's world, you never married?" Wichapi asked as they rested briefly, sharing a small pouch of pemmican. "No," Abigail replied. "In Boston, I was perhaps too focused on my studies. Then, after coming west, she trailed off, not quite able to articulate the complex social constraints that had limited her options as a respectable schoolteacher in a frontier town." Wichapi nodded thoughtfully. "I was married once, long ago. He died in battle with the Crow before our first child was born." She touched a small medicine pouch at her waist. "After that, the healing path became my companion." This simple exchange of personal histories deepened their connection beyond the practical necessities that had brought them together. For the first time, Abigail began to see Wichapi not just as her children's savior or as a representative of an unfamiliar culture, but as an individual woman with her own story of loss and resilience. As they returned to camp, arms laden with their medicinal harvest, Abigail realized that the survival skills she was acquiring went far beyond learning to build better fires or identify edible plants. She was learning something more fundamental: how to adapt, to find strength in community, and to value knowledge transmitted through generations of careful observation rather than written in books. These were lessons she would carry within her long after the snow melted, lessons that would reshape not just how she survived on the frontier, but how she understood her place within it. February brought a brief thaw, a false spring that melted the top layer of snow before plunging the region back into deep cold. For the Lakota, this weather pattern was familiar. Wolf Moon's trickery, the elders called it, warning younger members not to be fooled into thinking winter had released its grip. For Abigail and the children, now in their 4th week at the winter camp, the temporary warmth offered a welcome respite from the confines of the teepees. The children especially took advantage of the milder days, joining the Lakota youth in games that required more movement than the cramped indoor spaces had allowed. On one such afternoon, Abigail stood watching as Daniel participated in a mock hunt with several Lakota boys his age. Under the guidance of 2 hawks, one of the tribe's most respected hunters, the boys were practicing tracking skills, following deliberately planted signs that led them through a complex course around the camp's perimeter. "He has good eyes," a voice observed beside her. Abigail turned to find Chief Red Cloud had joined her, his gaze also fixed on the boys' activities. "Yes," she agreed. Daniel has always been observant, even before—" She hesitated, then continued. "Before he lost his parents, he noticed details others missed. A valuable trait," Red Cloud nodded. "Two Hawks says he listens well, does not rush to conclusions. This makes a good hunter, but also a good man." Abigail considered this assessment. In the classroom, she had valued Daniel's quick mind and diligence with lessons, but here in the Lakota camp, different qualities were being recognized and nurtured: patience, physical endurance, careful observation. She wondered how these experiences might shape the boy's future in ways her teaching alone never could. "You're Samuel," Red Cloud continued, gesturing toward another area of the camp where the younger boy was deep in conversation with Old Bear, the toolmaker. "He thinks with his hands. Old Bear says he has never seen a white child understand bone and sinew so quickly." Pride swelled in Abigail's chest, though the children weren't hers by blood. "And the girls?" she asked, curious about his observations. A rare smile crossed Red Cloud's weathered face. "Emma learns our songs already. Charlotte's fingers create beauty and beadwork that women twice her age admire." He paused. "And little one, Grace, she brings healing to Singing Bird's heart. The old wound of the lost grandchild begins to close." Before Abigail could respond, a commotion arose from the direction of the river. Several men were returning, calling out excitedly, even with her limited Lakota. Abigail recognized the word for fish, repeated often. "The river ice breaks in places," Red Cloud explained. "They find channel with many fish. Tonight we feast." The unexpected bounty transformed the camp's evening routine. Instead of separate family meals, a community gathering formed around enlarged fire pits, where the fish were roasted on green wood skewers. Children darted between adults, sharing in the festive atmosphere. Several elders began telling stories, their animated gestures transcending language barriers. Abigail sat with Wichapi and Hamani, the children scattered among their new friends. Looking around at the firelit faces, Abigail realized she could now recognize and name most of the camp's residents. More surprisingly, many called greetings to her by name, no longer viewing her as simply the white teacher, but as Abigail, a person with her own place in their winter community. "You are thinking deeply again," Wichapi observed, passing her a portion of roasted fish. "I'm thinking about belonging," Abigail admitted. "How quickly the children have found their places here. How unexpected all of this is." Hanmani, whose English had improved through attending Abigail's lessons, nodded in understanding. "Children adapt like willow branches. They bend with new winds, grow stronger." She glanced toward where Grace sat in Singing Bird's lap, listening intently to a story. "Some wounds heal better here than in white man's world." The observation struck Abigail as profoundly true. She had done her best to comfort the orphans after their losses, but the individualistic structure of white society had limited what she could offer. Here, surrounded by an extended community that viewed children as collective treasures rather than individual burdens, the healing seemed to be progressing more naturally. As if to underscore this point, Emma approached a Lakota girl named Mapia. Both were grinning with barely contained excitement. "Miss Winters," Emma began, "Mapia and I have been practicing something to share. May we?" At Abigail's encouraging nod, the two girls began singing, a traditional Lakota melody, but with alternating verses in English and Lakota. The song told of spring's arrival after a long winter, of new growth and returning birds. Their young voices, one light and one slightly deeper, blended in surprising harmony. A hush fell over the nearby conversations as more people turned to listen. When the girls finished, spontaneous applause erupted from both Lakota and white listeners. Emma beamed with pride, while Mapia ducked her head shyly, pleased but unaccustomed to such direct attention. "That was beautiful," Abigail told them both, noting how naturally Emma had adopted the pronunciation of the Lakota words. "How long have you been practicing?" "Many days," Mapia answered in careful English. "When we collect firewood, Emma teach me her words, I teach her our song." This small performance seemed to break some invisible barrier. Soon, other children were demonstrating their cross-cultural achievements. Samuel showing a small carving he'd made under Old Bear's tutelage, Charlotte displaying her first completed beadwork pattern. Even Daniel, typically reserved about his accomplishments, demonstrated a fire-starting technique, using only friction that he'd mastered after days of practice. As the evening progressed, the adults joined in the cultural exchange. One of the Lakota hunters, who had been attending Abigail's English lessons, recited a poem by Longfellow that she had taught the previous week, his pronunciation careful but recognizable. In return, Wichapi related a traditional Lakota creation story, with Abigail translating key elements for her 5 charges. Later, as the children were settled for the night in Hanmani's teepee, Wichapi invited Abigail to join a smaller gathering of women at her daughter's lodge. Initially hesitant to intrude on what seemed a private occasion, Abigail soon found herself welcomed into a circle of 6 women, ranging from young adulthood to elderly. "We gather to discuss matters of women," Wichapi explained as they entered. "The warmly lit teepee. Things men need not concern themselves with, healing women's ailments, easing difficult births, finding strength in times of loss. My daughter Takue leads these talks." Takue, a serene-faced woman perhaps a few years older than Abigail, greeted her with genuine warmth. "My mother says you have knowledge of plants from your Boston schools. We would hear of this." What followed was one of the most fascinating discussions of Abigail's life. The Lakota women shared generations of empirical knowledge about plants that regulated women's monthly cycles, eased childbirth pains, or helped with nursing infants. Abigail contributed what she had learned of formal medicine, explaining scientific concepts like infection and circulation in simple terms that Wichapi helped translate. Rather than dismissing her explanations as foreign nonsense, the women asked insightful questions, seeking to understand how these different approaches to healing might complement their traditional practices. Their pragmatic interest in effective remedies, regardless of cultural origin, reminded Abigail of the best scientific minds she had encountered in Boston, open to evidence, willing to test new ideas, but grounded in careful observation. This talk strengthens all women, Takue concluded as the gathering ended well after midnight. Different paths to the same wisdom. You return next moon? The invitation, so casually extended yet so significant in its implications of acceptance, touched Abigail deeply. "I would be honored," she replied, realizing she genuinely meant it. As February deepened, so did the connections between the two communities joined by circumstance. Individual relationships flourished as initial wariness gave way to recognition of shared humanity. Samuel became Old Bear's shadow, arriving at the elders' tipi each morning, eager to learn new crafting techniques. Charlotte and a girl named Washanli became inseparable, developing a complex private language that combined English, Lakota, and their own invented words. Most remarkable was Grace's transformation. The traumatized, nearly mute child who had arrived at the camp now chatted freely, especially with Singing Bird, who had effectively become her surrogate grandmother. The elderly woman taught Grace traditional songs and stories, while Grace shared the few precious memories of her parents that she could recall, keeping their memory alive through this new relationship. For Daniel, the oldest of the orphans, the transition was more complex. At 12, he was caught between childhood and the adult responsibilities he had prematurely assumed after his parents' deaths. In Rivers Bend, he had appointed himself protector of the younger children, particularly his sister Emma, carrying a burden too heavy for his young shoulders. In the Lakota camp, however, this role was gently but firmly redistributed. The communal Care of children meant that Daniel was both relieved of his self-imposed guardianship and guided toward age-appropriate growth by the tribe's men. Two hawks particularly took an interest in the boy, including him in increasingly challenging hunting and tracking exercises. "He needs to be a boy before a man," the hunter explained to Abigail after returning from a full-day expedition where Daniel had helped check distant traps. "White world makes children grow too fast sometimes. Here, each season of life has purpose." Abigail couldn't argue with the results. Daniel's perpetually furrowed brow had relaxed, and he occasionally joined in the raucous games of the younger children, something he would have considered beneath his dignity in Rivers Bend. Yet he was also developing genuine skills and confidence, under male mentorship that Abigail, for all her education, couldn't have provided. Emma, meanwhile, blossomed under the collective attention of the camp's women. Always musical, she absorbed Lakota songs like a sponge, her clear voice often heard joining in workday melodies as women processed hides or prepared food. She developed a particular interest in the tribe's complex oral traditions, pestering the storytellers for repeated tellings until she had memorized several legends word for word. "She has a strong memory mind," Singing Bird commented to Abigail. "Our people value this. Before white man's books, our history lived in those who could remember and tell true." For Abigail herself, the deepening integration brought unexpected challenges to her worldview. Having been raised with clear boundaries between civilized and savage, between Christian and heathen beliefs, she found these distinctions increasingly difficult to maintain in the face of daily evidence that contradicted her preconceptions. One snowy afternoon, while the children were occupied with various activities, Abigail joined Wichapi on a mission to check snares in a distant stand of trees. As they trudged through knee-deep snow, Abigail gathered her courage to ask a question that had been troubling her. "Wichapi," she began hesitantly, "your people's spiritual beliefs, they're very different from what I was taught." The medicine woman nodded but remained silent, sensing more was to come. "I was raised Christian," Abigail continued. "We're taught there is one true God, and that other beliefs are—" She paused, searching for a diplomatic phrase. "Are wrong," Wichapi finished for her, without rancor. "Yes, the black robes who visit the agencies tell us this also. But I've seen such wisdom in your ways," Abigail admitted. "Such harmony with the natural world, such community among your people. It makes me question." Wichapi stopped walking and turned to face her directly. "The great mystery that white men call God is too vast for any people to fully understand," she said simply. "We see different parts of the same great truth, like blind men touching different parts of the buffalo. One feels the horn and says, 'It is sharp and hard.' Another feels the hide and says it is soft and warm. Both speak truth, but neither has the whole." The wisdom of this perspective stunned Abigail into silence. It offered a framework for understanding cultural differences that her education had never provided. Not a hierarchy of truth with one culture at the pinnacle, but a shared, incomplete glimpse of something too vast for any single tradition to fully encompass. As they continued their journey, checking the snares which had caught two rabbits, Wichapi expanded on her beliefs, describing the Lakota understanding of a world filled with spirit in all things, animals, plants, rivers, mountains, all deserving of respect and existing in a delicate balance that humans were responsible for maintaining. "This does not mean your Jesus road is wrong," she concluded, as they headed back toward camp, their catch secured. "Only that great mystery speaks in many voices to many peoples." That evening, as Abigail recorded the day's events in the small journal she'd managed to keep throughout their ordeal, she found herself re-evaluating not just her spiritual understandings, but her entire concept of education. What was truly important for her 5 charges to learn? Reading, writing, and arithmetic remained essential, but so too were the practical skills and community values they were absorbing in the Lakota camp. If they eventually returned to white society, when they returned, she corrected herself, would these children be able to integrate these different worlds of knowledge? Or would they be forced to choose one over the other, losing valuable wisdom in the process? The question took on immediate relevance the following day, when a hunting party returned with troubling news. They had ventured farther north than usual, following elk tracks, and had spotted fresh signs of white travelers, the remains of a campfire, tracks of shod horses, and discarded food tins. Soldiers, perhaps, Red Cloud speculated during the hastily called council meeting where Abigail was asked to attend. Or traders from Fort Madison breaking trail early. Either way, it means paths will soon open as snow melts. The implications were clear. As winter released its grip on the territory, contact with the white world would resume. Decisions would need to be made about Abigail and the orphans' future, 3, maybe 4 weeks before full thaw, Two Hawks estimated, depending on rains and sun. Abigail felt a complex surge of emotions at this news. Part of her recognized the practical necessity of eventually returning to Rivers Bend. She had responsibilities there, and the town council would be expecting to find her and the children at the schoolhouse when they returned in spring. The orphans' legal status and futures would need to be addressed within the structures of white society. Yet another part of her recoiled at the thought of leaving the community that had not just saved their lives, but had begun to heal wounds deeper than frostbite and hunger. Here, the children had found a sense of belonging that the fragmented remains of Rivers Bend might never provide. That night, after the children were asleep, Abigail found herself unable to rest. She slipped outside, wrapping herself in a buffalo robe as she gazed up at the stars scattered like frost across the black sky. The camp was mostly quiet, with only the occasional crackling of banked fires and the distant howl of a wolf pack breaking the stillness. Trouble follows thinking in darkness. Wichapi's voice came softly as she approached, her breath visible in the cold air. The news today, Abigail acknowledged, about the signs of travelers. Wichapi settled beside her on a fallen log that had been cleared of snow. You fear returning to your world. It wasn't a question, but Abigail answered anyway. Not for myself, for them. She gestured toward Hanmani's teepee where the children slept. They've found something precious here. I don't know what awaits them in Rivers Bend. An orphanage, perhaps, or separation as they're sent to different families. Wichapi was quiet for a long moment before responding. The path ahead has many turns, some we cannot see from where we stand now. She placed a hand briefly on Abigail's shoulder. But remember, teacher from Boston, bridges built between our peoples through these children cannot be easily broken. Whatever comes, that remains. As they sat together under the vast, starlit sky, Abigail found comfort in this perspective. The connections formed over these winter months, the shared knowledge, the mutual respect, the bonds between individuals, these were real achievements that would endure regardless of physical separation. Still, as February gave way to March, and the first genuine signs of spring began to appear, the question of their eventual departure loomed larger. The children, perceptive as always, sensed the underlying tension despite Abigail's efforts to maintain normalcy. "Do we have to go back?" Emma asked one morning as they worked together collecting kindling. "I like it here. Mapia is teaching me to play the hand drum." "Rivers Bend is our home," Abigail replied gently, though the words sounded hollow even to her own ears. Was a half-empty settlement truly home to these children whose parents were buried there? "Could some of them come with us?" Charlotte suggested, her practical nature seeking compromise. "Or could we visit sometimes?" These innocent questions had no simple answers in a world where the boundaries between white and native communities were enforced by both custom and law. Abigail offered non-committal responses, promising only that they would not forget their Lakota friends, whatever the future held. As she navigated these difficult conversations, Abigail noticed the Lakota community was also preparing for eventual transition. Their winter camp had always been temporary, designed to shelter them during the harshest months before they would move to spring hunting grounds where new grass would attract game. Preparations for this seasonal migration were beginning. Equipment being repaired, stores inventoried, scouts sent to assess conditions in traditional spring territories. These activities provided a timely reminder that change was the only constant, that no situation, however comfortable, remained static indefinitely. One evening, as Abigail sat with Wichapi sorting the medicinal plants they had gathered throughout winter, preserving some and preparing others for transport, the medicine woman addressed the unspoken concern directly. "When time comes for paths to divide," she said carefully, "remember that paths can also cross again. What is learned remains. What is felt remains." She selected a particularly robust root, handing it to Abigail. "Like this medicine plant, even when not seen above ground, it lives below, ready to emerge when needed." The metaphor offered both comfort and wisdom as Abigail contemplated the inevitable changes approaching with spring's thaw. Whatever decisions would need to be made in the coming weeks, the connections formed during this extraordinary winter had taken root too deeply to be easily severed. March arrived with the unpredictable temperament typical of Dakota territory. Springs, days of brilliant sunshine and melting snow, followed by sudden squalls that temporarily restored winter's grip. The thaw proceeded in fits and starts, but its overall progression was undeniable. Patches of bare ground began to appear on south-facing slopes, and the river ice broke up in sections, its surface a patchwork of solid sheets and open, rushing water. For Abigail and the children, now in their 7th week with the Lakota, these changes brought the unavoidable reality of decisions that could no longer be postponed. The town council of Riversbend would be returning soon, expecting to find them at the schoolhouse. Questions of the orphans' futures would need to be addressed within the legal frameworks of white society. Yet as Abigail watched the children moving confidently through their daily activities in camp, speaking a fluid mixture of English and Lakota, dressed in clothing that similarly blended elements of both cultures, she wondered if a simple return to their previous lives was even possible, let alone desirable. These reflections were interrupted one crisp morning by the arrival of 2 hawks and 3 other hunters, returning earlier than expected from what was meant to be a 3-day expedition. Their expressions were grave as they went directly to Red Cloud's teepee, bypassing the usual greetings and camp protocols. Word spread quickly. The hunters had encountered white men just a day's ride from camp. Not soldiers as initially feared, but a party of 5 settlers from Fort Madison, traveling with a half-Santee Sioux guide. They were searching for survivors from outlying homesteads and settlements following the Great Blizzard, checking each location systematically as the melting snow made travel possible. Red Cloud called a council meeting immediately, with Abigail, once again invited to attend. As she entered the chief's teepee, she noted a heightened tension among the gathered elders and leaders. "These searchers," Red Cloud began, once everyone was seated, "they have heard rumors of white children among our people. Their guide, who speaks good English, told our hunters they seek a missing schoolteacher and orphans from a place called Riversbend." A murmur passed through the gathered council. Abigail felt her heart rate accelerate. "Did they name me specifically?" she asked. 2 hawks nodded. "They asked for Abigail Winters and 5 children. They town leaders worry when there is no smoke from the schoolhouse chimney for many days." The implications were clear. Their absence had been noticed, and a search party was actively looking for them. the peaceful isolation of their winter. Refuge was coming to an end. What did you tell them? Wichapi asked her brother. That we would bring word to our chief, Two Hawks replied. Nothing more. They camp near Split Rock, waiting for our response. Their guide knows our ways. He will expect proper counsel before any decision. Red Cloud turned to Abigail, his expression grave but compassionate. Teacher from Boston, now you must decide. These men search for you with concern, not hostility. If you wish to rejoin your people, we will escort you safely to them. The directness of the question momentarily robbed Abigail of speech. In her heart, she had known this moment would come. Yet facing it now made her realize how unprepared she truly was. Her gaze moved to Wichapi, seeking guidance, but the medicine woman's face remained carefully neutral. This was Abigail's decision to make. I need to speak with the children first, she finally said. Their futures are at stake even more than mine, and I would like time to consider what is best for all of us. Red Cloud nodded. This is wise. The searchers can wait one more day for an answer. Speak with the little ones, then with your own spirit. As the council dispersed, Wichapi fell into step beside Abigail. You are troubled, she observed quietly. More confused than troubled, Abigail admitted. I have obligations to River's Bend. They employed me, trusted me with the town's children. Yet the orphans have found something here that they might never find again in white society. And you? Wichapi asked. What have you found? The question caught Abigail off guard. She had been so focused on the children's well-being that she had given little thought to her own preferences. What had she found among the Lakota? Knowledge, certainly. Practical skills that had transformed her understanding of survival, but also a community that valued her contributions while challenging her to grow beyond the narrow confines of her previous identity. I've found a different way of seeing, she answered finally, of teaching and learning, of living in relation to others and to the natural world. Wichapi nodded, satisfied with this response. Come, the children wait. Truth must be spoken with care, but it must be spoken. Gathering the 5 orphans proved challenging, as each was absorbed in different activities throughout the camp. Daniel was with 2 hawks, examining the tracks of an unusual animal they had spotted near the river. Samuel worked alongside Old Bear, putting the finishing touches on a small carved horse he had been creating for weeks. Emma and Mapia were practicing a new song with several other girls, while Charlotte helped Hanmani sort fresh plants brought in by the gatherers. Grace, as usual, shadowed Singing Bird, carrying a tiny medicine pouch the elderly woman had made especially for her. When finally assembled in Hanmani's tipi, the children sensed the seriousness of the situation immediately. They sat in a small semicircle, their expressions ranging from curiosity to apprehension. I have news, Abigail began, choosing her words carefully. Hunters have met men from Fort Madison who are searching for us. They've been sent by the Rivers Bend Town Council to make sure we survived the blizzard. They want us to go back, Daniel stated flatly. It wasn't a question. They're concerned about us, Abigail corrected gently, as they should be. They left us in their care, and they're responsible for ensuring our safety. But we are safe, Emma protested. Safer than we were in the schoolhouse with no wood and little food. That's true, Abigail acknowledged, and we owe Wichapi and her people our lives for that. But now we need to think about what happens next. Spring is coming. The town council will return to Rivers Bend soon. They'll expect to find us there. What? If we don't want to go back? Samuel asked, his young face unusually serious. Abigail sighed. That's what we need to discuss. Each of you has formed connections here. I understand that, but there are complications. Because they're Indians, and we're not, Daniel said, his directness cutting through any attempt at diplomacy. Yes, Abigail admitted, the world beyond this camp has strict ideas about white children living among native people. Even if we wanted to stay, there might be legal challenges. Charlotte, always the practical one, asked the question Abigail had been dreading. Would they separate us if we go back to River's Bend? The possibility hung in the air like a physical presence. Without parents or legal guardians, the children would become wards of the territory. The likelihood of all 5 being placed with the same family was vanishingly small. I don't know, Abigail answered truthfully. I would do everything in my power to keep you together, but I can't make promises about decisions that aren't mine to make. Little Grace, who had been silent until now, suddenly spoke up. I don't want to leave Singing Bird. She knows all the stories. She helps me not be sad about Mama and Papa. Her simple statement cut straight to the heart of the matter. Each child had found healing connections that had begun to repair the trauma of their losses. Severing these connections might reopen wounds that had only just begun to close. What do you think we should do, Miss Winters? Emma asked, her trust in Abigail's judgment still absolute, despite the complexities of their situation. Abigail looked at their 5 faces, expectant, concerned, but also stronger and more confident than they had been that desperate day when Wichapi appeared at the schoolhouse door. Whatever decision was made, these children were not the same ones who had huddled fearfully around the dying stove as the blizzard raged outside. I think, she said carefully, that we should sleep on this important question. Tomorrow morning, we'll talk again, and then I'll meet with the council to discuss our options before any answer is sent to the search party. It wasn't the decisive response they had hoped for, but the children accepted it, recognizing the gravity of the choice before them. As they dispersed to their various activities, Abigail noticed how each lingered with their special friends, Daniel with 2 hawks, Emma with Mapia, Grace clinging to Singing Bird's hand a little tighter than usual. That evening, as darkness settled over the camp, Abigail found herself once again seeking the clarity that seemed to come only under the vast Dakota sky. She sat on the same fallen log where she and Wichapi had talked weeks earlier, watching as the first stars appeared against the deepening blue. Your spirit is troubled, a voice observed. But this time it belonged not to Wichapi, but to Red Cloud, who approached with the dignified bearing that never seemed to desert him, even in informal moments. May I join you? He asked, respecting her privacy despite his status as chief. Of course, Abigail replied, surprised but not displeased by his company. Throughout their stay, Red Cloud had maintained a certain distance, not unfriendly, but careful to delegate most interactions with her to Wichapi or other tribal members. He settled beside her, his gaze also turning skyward. When I was a young man, he began without preamble, I believed the way forward for my people was clear. Resist the white man's advance. Protect our traditions, our hunting grounds, our way of life. He paused. I fought in many battles with this belief in my heart. Abigail remained silent, sensing he was leading to something important. Now I am older, he continued. I have seen more winters, more changes than young warriors can imagine. I have spoken with my great father in Washington, seen the iron horse that brings more settlers each season, watched our hunting grounds shrink like snow under spring sun. His weathered face reflected both resignation and determination. The world transforms, whether we wish it or not. The question becomes how to walk into this new world with dignity and wisdom. How have you answered that question? Abigail asked, genuinely curious. Red Cloud considered before responding. I believe our people must learn white man's ways, not to become white, but to understand, to find a path through a changed landscape. He met her gaze directly. Just as you have learned our ways these past moons, the parallel struck Abigail forcefully. She had indeed been transformed by her time among the Lakota, incorporating new knowledge and perspectives without abandoning her core identity. The children Red Cloud continued. They stand at crossroads. They belong to White World by birth, yet they have touched our world now. They carry both inside them. That's what makes this decision so difficult, Abigail admitted. They found healing here that they might not find in Riversbend, but legally, emotionally, culturally, their futures lie primarily in white society. Red Cloud nodded, understanding her dilemma. Perhaps the answer is not either or, but both and. Before Abigail could ask him to elaborate, Red Cloud rose to his feet. Council fire burns before dawn. Bring your thoughts then. Now I leave you to listen to stars. They have wisdom older than either of our peoples. As he walked away, his words echoed in Abigail's mind. Not either or, but both and. Was there a path that could preserve what the children had gained here? While reintegrating them into the world, they would ultimately need to navigate. She remained under the stars for over an hour, turning possibilities over in her mind. When she finally returned to Hanmani's teepee, a plan was beginning to take shape. Not perfect, fraught with challenges, but offering a bridge between worlds that might serve the children better than a complete rupture. Dawn broke clear and cold, with a pale sun rising over frosted ground. The council fire was already burning when Abigail arrived, the elders and leaders seated in their traditional circle. The children had been invited as well, an unusual honor that acknowledged their stake in the decisions to be made. Once all were gathered, Red Cloud opened the proceedings with ceremonial words in Lakota, followed by the ritual passing of the pipe. Then he turned to Abigail. Teacher from Boston, you have thought on this matter of returning to your people. The council would hear your words. Taking a deep breath, Abigail rose to her feet. I have considered what is best for the children, and for all concerned, she began, and I believe we must return to Riversbend. A murmur passed through the assembly. Daniel's face hardened, while Emma looked close to tears. Little Grace pressed herself against Singing Bird's side. However, Abigail continued, raising her hand for attention, I propose that our return be conditional, not complete. The murmuring stopped. All eyes focused intently on her. These children have formed bonds here that have helped them heal from terrible losses, she explained. To sever these connections entirely would cause new harm. Therefore, I suggest a compromise. She outlined her plan. They would return to Riversbend as expected, reassuring the town council and establishing their legal status. Abigail would formally petition to become the children's guardian, keeping them together in the schoolhouse that was already their home. But they would maintain connection with the Lakota community through regular visits during suitable seasons, and through inviting Wichapi and others to visit them in turn. The children would continue their white education, she concluded, but would also preserve the knowledge and relationships they've gained here. They would become bridges between our worlds rather than being forced to choose one over the other. When she finished speaking, silence fell over the council circle. Red Cloud's expression remained unreadable as he turned to the children. Young ones, you have heard. What are your thoughts? Daniel, as the oldest, spoke first. His initial resistance had softened as he listened to Abigail's proposal. If Miss Winters becomes our guardian, will we stay together? That is my intention, Abigail confirmed. I cannot guarantee the territorial authorities will agree, but as your teacher and the person who has cared for you through the winter, I have a strong case. Emma looked to Mapia, who sat with the other Lakota children at the edge of the circle. We could still see each other, learn more songs. Wichapi answered this question. The summer camp our people make for berry harvesting is only a half-day's ride from your settlement. Visits would be possible then, and perhaps at other times. Samuel turned to Old Bear. Would you still teach me carving when I visit? The elderly craftsman nodded solemnly. My hands grow older, need young ones to pass knowledge to. You come, I teach. Charlotte, ever practical, addressed a logistical concern. How would we travel back and forth? It's too far to walk alone. That, Red Cloud interjected, could be arranged through our hunters who trade at Fort Madison. They pass near River's Bend on established trails. Only Grace remained unconvinced, her small face troubled as she clung to Singing Bird. The elderly woman whispered something in her ear that finally brought a reluctant nod of acceptance. Red Cloud surveyed the group, gauging the emerging consensus. And you, Wichapi, the safety of these children through winter was your responsibility. What say you to this plan? All eyes turned to the medicine woman who had been uncharacteristically silent throughout the discussion. Her thoughtful gaze moved from Abigail to each of the children before she spoke. The path Abigail suggests has many thorns, misunderstandings from both peoples, difficulties of travel, changes that none can foresee. She paused. Yet it offers hope that bridges built during our winter together will stand through seasons to come. I support this path. With Wichapi's endorsement, the council moved toward agreement. The practical details were discussed. When they would depart, who would accompany them, what gifts would be exchanged according to Lakota custom. 2 Hawks would lead the escort party, traveling first to the search group at Split Rock to establish peaceful contact, then continuing on to River's Bend once the snow had melted enough for safe passage. As the council disbanded, the reality of their imminent departure settled over the group. They would have perhaps a week, maybe less, before travel became possible. Each day would be precious, filled with preparations both practical and emotional. That afternoon, as Abigail helped Hanmani and several other women prepare special traveling food for the journey ahead, she noticed the children making their own preparations. Each had sought out their closest Lakota friends, spending time in activities that seemed designed to create lasting memories. Daniel and 2 Hawks disappeared on a special tracking exercise, returning hours later with a pair of rabbits and Daniel's face glowing with pride. Samuel sat with Old Bear for an extended lesson, his hands moving with increasing confidence as he learned new carving techniques. Emma and Mapia, joined by Charlotte and several other girls, recorded songs on a small hide scroll, using a pictographic system to help Emma remember the melodies and Lakota words. Most poignant was Grace's time with Singing Bird. The elderly woman took the child on a slow walk to specific locations around the camp, seemingly transferring memories tied to each place. At the river's edge, near a distinctive boulder, at the base of a twisted pine, at each stop, Singing Bird would speak earnestly while Grace listened with solemn attention. When they returned, Grace approached Abigail with unusual determination. "Singing Bird gave me stories to keep," she announced. "She said they're mine now to remember her by. I'm supposed to tell them to my children someday." The simple statement carried immense cultural significance, an elder deliberately passing oral traditions to a child outside the tribe, entrusting her with their preservation. It was both an honor and a responsibility that the 6-year-old seemed to understand intuitively. That evening, an unusually warm breeze from the south reinforced what everyone already knew. Spring was accelerating, and with it, the moment of parting drew nearer. The camp gathered for a special meal, celebrating the bonds formed during their shared winter while acknowledging the separation to come. As the communal fires burned low, Red Cloud rose to address the gathering. His words, translated by Wichapi for Abigail and the children, spoke of cycles and seasons, of partings followed by reunions, of knowledge shared that could never be taken away. "The winter that brought you to us was harsh," he concluded, "but from its coldness grew warm friendships. Remember this when you return to your world, that sometimes from greatest hardship comes greatest gift." Later, as the children finally succumbed to sleep after the emotional day, Abigail stepped outside once more. The night was unusually mild, with stars scattered across the sky like the beadwork on a Lakota dress. Wichapi joined her, the 2 women, standing in companionable silence for several minutes before the medicine woman spoke. "You have chosen a difficult path," she observed. "Easier to simply return or simply stay. Harder to walk between worlds." "Like you've done throughout your life," Abigail replied, remembering how Wichapi had mentioned trading at the fort, interacting with officials, gathering knowledge from both cultures. "Yes," Wichapi acknowledged. "This is why I understand both. The value and the cost of what you propose." She turned to face Abigail directly. "The children will face challenges from both sides. Some whites will view them with suspicion for their connection to Lakota ways. Some of my people will question their commitment for returning to white world. They'll have me to defend them," Abigail said firmly. "And you, when you visit." Wichapi nodded, a rare smile softening her features. "Two shields are better than one." She reached into a small pouch at her waist and withdrew something wrapped in a soft hide. "For you to remember our teachings." Unwrapping the package, Abigail found a beautifully crafted medicine pouch, similar to the one Wichapi always wore. But smaller, decorated with intricate beadwork in patterns she recognized as symbols of healing and protection. "It contains seeds of the plants I taught you to find," Wichapi explained. "Some will grow near your schoolhouse if planted with care. Others will remind you to visit places where they grow wild." The gift represented far more than practical herbalism. It was an invitation to maintain her connection to the knowledge and relationships she had formed here, just as she hoped to do for the children. "Thank you," Abigail said simply, knowing that elaborate expressions of gratitude were less valued in Lakota culture than sincere acknowledgement. As they stood together under the stars, Abigail realized that whatever challenges lay ahead in implementing her ambitious plan, this moment, this connection, was already proof that bridges between worlds were not only possible, but necessary. The path might indeed have thorns, as Wichapi had warned in council, but it also held the promise of a richer, more complete understanding for all who dared to walk it. 3 days after the council meeting, a sudden warm spell accelerated the spring thaw beyond anyone's expectations. The river ice broke up completely overnight, its rushing waters swollen with snowmelt from the surrounding hills. Trails that had been impassable became muddy but navigable, and the search party at Split Rock sent a runner to inquire about the council's decision. The moment of departure, which Abigail had thought they would have more time to prepare for, was suddenly upon them. Two Hawks assembled an escort party of 6 warriors, while the camp mobilized to gather traveling provisions and appropriate gifts, according to Lakota custom. "We leave at midday," Two Hawks informed Abigail as the morning sun rose in a clear sky. "The white searchers grow impatient, but also concerned for your safety. It is best we bring you to them directly." Abigail nodded, her heart heavy despite her conviction that they were making the right choice. "We'll be ready," she promised, though in truth no amount of preparation could make them emotionally ready for the parting ahead. The children approached the impending departure with varying reactions. Daniel, always the one to shoulder responsibility, helped pack their few possessions and participated in the practical arrangements with stoic determination. Emma vacillated between excitement about returning to Rivers Bend and tearful goodbyes with Mapia and other friends. Samuel withdrew into focused work, completing a final carving project under Old Bear's guidance. Charlotte made small, beaded gifts for each of her Lakota friends, working until her fingers were sore, and Grace shadowed Singing Bird more closely than ever, as if trying to absorb every possible moment with her adopted grandmother. By mid-morning, the camp had gathered near the council fire to share a final meal with their departing guests. The atmosphere was solemn but not somber. Lakota custom viewed partings as natural transitions rather than endings to be mourned. Red Cloud presided over the gathering, his dignified presence setting the tone. "Today, our winter companions return. To their people," he began, with Wichapi translating his words. They came to us through Whichapi's vision, brought by the great storm. They leave as friends, carrying our ways in their hearts. The meal that followed was more elaborate than their usual fare, featuring special dishes prepared in honor of the occasion. Throughout the camp, small bundles and packages appeared, gifts being assembled for Abigail and each child according to Lakota tradition. As they ate, Hanmani approached with 5 beautifully crafted medicine bags, smaller than Whichapi's, but similar to the one Abigail had received nights earlier. "For the children," she explained, presenting them with formal dignity. "Each contains a special stone from the river, bit of fur from their first animal sighting here, and a small pouch of our sacred tobacco. Protection on journey and reminder of Lakota friends." The children accepted these gifts with appropriate solemnity, understanding their significance even without detailed explanation. Daniel immediately hung his around his neck, tucking it beneath his shirt, as he had seen 2 hawks do with his own medicine pouch. Old Bear presented Samuel with the tools they had made together, a small carving knife with a bone handle, several specialized implements for detailed work, and a collection of partially prepared wood pieces for future projects. "Strong hands need good tools," he said simply, his weathered face showing rare emotion as Samuel clutched the gifts to his chest. For Emma and Charlotte, Mapia and several other girls had prepared matching ceremonial dresses, smaller versions, of the garments worn by Lakota women during important events. The dresses featured intricate beadwork that told stories of winter survival and spring renewal, narratives that both girls could now read thanks to their cultural education over the past weeks. Grace's gift came last and proved the most emotionally charged. Singing Bird approached carrying a small cradle board, beautifully decorated with protective symbols and fitted with a tiny fur-wrapped doll. "For remembering," the elderly woman explained as Grace accepted the gift with wide eyes. "When you feel alone, rock the doll and sing songs I taught you. My spirit will hear." The exchange of gifts continued as Abigail presented the tokens of appreciation she had prepared with the children's help. For Hanmani, who had shared her tipi so generously, they had created a book of pressed flowers and plants, each page containing a specimen along with its name written in both English and Lakota. For Red Cloud, Daniel had carefully transcribed several treaty texts that the chief had asked about, providing clearer versions than the often deliberately confusing documents shown to tribal leaders. Other gifts followed, small items made, meaningful by the relationships they represented. As midday approached, the escort party made final preparations for departure. Travois were attached to 2 horses, loaded with provisions and the gifts they had received. The children would take turns riding and walking, with 2 hawks calculating they could reach the search party's camp before nightfall. The actual moment of departure proved both more and less difficult than Abigail had anticipated. Lakota custom discouraged excessive displays of emotion during partings, providing a cultural framework that helped contain the children's feelings within manageable bounds. Yet the depth of connection that had formed during their winter together was evident in every carefully controlled farewell, every lingering glance, every promise to maintain contact when possible. Whichapi stood slightly apart as the others said their goodbyes, her expression impassive but her eyes missing nothing. When Abigail finally approached her, words seemed inadequate to express the complexity of their relationship. Savior, teacher, friend, sister of the spirit. Our paths joined. In snow and separate in mud, Whichapi observed with characteristic directness, a hint of humor lightening her tone. "This seems fitting somehow." Abigail smiled despite the tightness in her chest. "I wouldn't have survived the winter without your knowledge, nor would the children. But what you've given us goes far beyond physical survival." Whichapi nodded, acknowledging this truth. And you have given my people something also, glimpse of white teacher who sees with open eyes, children who learn with open hearts. This helps heal old wounds. From her dress pocket, Abigail withdrew a small package wrapped in clean linen, her final gift, saved for this moment. Inside was her mother's silver necklace, the only piece of jewelry she had brought from Boston, a simple pendant bearing a tree design. "For the woman who restored our life tree when it was nearly felled," she said, offering it to Wichapi. The medicine woman accepted the gift with appropriate solemnity, recognizing its personal significance without need for elaborate explanation. From her own neck, she removed a carved stone pendant suspended on a leather cord. "Eagle stone," she explained, placing it in Abigail's palm. "Found on a sacred mountain when I first began medicine path. It sees far, like your teacher's heart. Must do for these children." The exchange completed their farewell with perfect symmetry, each entrusting the other with an object that embodied their personal journey. With final words of gratitude to Red Cloud and the assembled camp, Abigail joined the children and their escort. As they departed, following the muddy trail that led eventually to Split Rock and beyond to River's Bend, no one looked back. Lakota tradition held that backward glances weakened the spirit for the journey ahead, and their journey, Abigail knew, would require all the strength they could muster. The first part of their travel passed in relative silence, each lost in private thoughts as they adjusted to the reality of transition. Two hawks set a moderate pace, mindful of the children's shorter legs and the muddy conditions that made each step more taxing. Around mid-afternoon, as they paused for a brief rest near a small stream, Daniel approached Abigail with an uncharacteristic hesitancy in his manner. "Miss Winters," he began, choosing his words carefully, "when we get back to River's Bend, will we have to pretend this never happened?" The question caught her by surprise. "Pretend what never happened, Daniel?" "Living with the Lakota," he clarified, "learning their ways. Some folks in town talked pretty harshly about Indians before the fever came. They might not understand why we—" He trailed off, struggling to articulate his concern. Abigail considered her response carefully, aware that Two Hawks and the other escorts were within earshot. "We won't lie about where we've been or who saved us," she said firmly. "But we'll need to be thoughtful about how we share our experiences. Some people may indeed find it difficult to understand the connection we've formed with Wichapi and the others." "Like building a bridge," Samuel interjected, having wandered over during their conversation. "Old Bear says good bridges need support on both sides. We have to prepare the ground on our side so the bridge doesn't collapse." The wisdom in this metaphor struck Abigail forcefully. Yes, they would need to prepare the ground, helping the people of River's Bend understand the circumstances that had led to their winter with the Lakota, emphasizing the humanity and generosity they had experienced, gradually introducing the idea of continued cultural exchange rather than expecting immediate acceptance. "That's exactly right, Samuel," she agreed. "And we'll start by telling the search party the complete truth about how Wichapi saved our lives when we were hours from death in the blizzard. Gratitude is something everyone can understand." By late afternoon, they sighted the search party's camp near the distinctive split formation that gave the location its name. Smoke from their fire rose in a straight column in the still air, and several horses grazed on the new grass emerging from the melting snow. Two Hawks halted their procession just within sight of the camp. "I will go first," he explained, with white flag to show a peaceful approach. "You wait until I signal." Abigail nodded her agreement with this prudent approach. Despite the search party's presumed friendly intentions, the sight of 6 armed Lakota warriors could easily be misinterpreted without proper introduction. They watched as Two Hawks rode forward alone, a white cloth attached to his lance fluttering. In the breeze, the camp stirred at his approach, men emerging from tents with rifles at the ready, but held non-aggressively as they recognized the peace signal. After a brief parley that appeared cordial from a distance, Two Hawks turned and waved for the rest of their party to approach. As they did so, Abigail studied the search party. 5 white men dressed in practical frontier clothing and one individual who appeared to be the half-Santee guide mentioned in earlier reports. At the forefront stood a tall man with a thick, grey beard, whom Abigail immediately recognized. Harold Jenkins, the head of the Rivers Bend Town Council and owner of the settlement's general store. His expression registered shock, then relief, as he identified Abigail and the children among the Lakota escort. "Miss Winters," he called out, striding forward to meet them. "Thank the Lord! We feared the worst when we found the schoolhouse abandoned." "Mr. Jenkins," Abigail acknowledged as they reached speaking distance. "As you can see, we're quite well, thanks entirely to Wichapi, a Lakota medicine woman, and her people who took us in when the blizzard left us without sufficient supplies." Jenkins's gaze moved over their party, noting the children's healthy appearance and their clothing that merged white and Lakota elements. His expression registered confusion, but to his credit, he responded with measured courtesy. "Then we owe these folks our gratitude," he said, nodding respectfully toward Two Hawks. "When we found no sign of you at the schoolhouse and the grave marker behind it, we feared the grave belongs to no one from Rivers Bend," Abigail assured him quickly. "It was there when we arrived, likely a traveler caught in an earlier storm." Relief visibly washed over Jenkins's features. "Well, this is mighty good news to bring back to town. Everyone's been worried sick, especially after the fever took so many." He gestured toward their camp. "Come, rest a spell before we head back. We've got coffee brewing and some decent provisions." Two Hawks conferred briefly with Abigail. "We will camp separately," he decided, "but nearby. Better for all. In the morning, we will travel together to your settlement." This arrangement suited everyone, creating a buffer of space while maintaining the alliance. As the two camps established themselves within sight of each other, the half-Santee guide introduced himself to Abigail. "James Blackburn," he said, offering his hand in the white man's custom, though his features reflected his mixed heritage. "I work as an interpreter and guide out of Fort Madison." "I'm pleased to meet you, Mr. Blackburn," Abigail replied. "Your presence here has certainly helped smooth this meeting." Blackburn nodded, his expression thoughtful, as he observed the children interacting comfortably with their Lakota escorts. "Not many white children get the chance to live among the people," he commented. "It changes how they see the world. It changes how we all see the world," Abigail agreed. "Though I suspect you understand that better than most." A smile briefly crossed his face. "Walking between worlds ain't easy, ma'am, but it has its rewards." He glanced toward Jenkins and the other searchers. "Just a word of caution. These men mean well, but they have limited understanding of Lakota ways. You might want to ease them into your story gradually." Abigail appreciated his insight. "That's wise counsel, Mr. Blackburn. Perhaps you could help facilitate that understanding as we travel." "Be happy to," he agreed. "And if you're serious about maintaining connection with the Lakota camp, I regularly travel routes that could carry messages or arrange meetings when conditions permit." This unexpected offer represented the first concrete support for the bridge-building plan Abigail had proposed. She accepted gratefully, recognizing that practical logistics would be as important as cultural sensitivity in maintaining the connections they had formed. That evening, as the children bedded down near the Lakota campfire rather than joining the search party, a choice Jenkins observed with raised eyebrows but did not comment upon, Abigail found herself contemplating the journey ahead with clearer eyes. The physical travel back to Rivers Bend would be straightforward enough, but the cultural and emotional journey of reintegration while preserving their Lakota connections would require careful navigation. Morning dawned clear and mild. Perfect. Traveling weather. Both camps broke fast and prepared for departure with practiced efficiency. As they assembled for the journey to Riversbend, now just a day's travel away, Jenkins approached Abigail with an air of having reached a decision. After considerable thought, "Miss Winters," he began formally, "the council will want a full accounting of your experiences when we return. Before that happens, I'd like to understand better what you've been through and what your expectations are going forward." His directness was refreshing. "My expectations, Mr. Jenkins? About your position, the children's situation and," he hesitated, glancing toward Two Hawks and the Lakota escort, "your continuing association with the Sioux." Abigail appreciated the opportunity to outline her thoughts before facing the full council. As they began traveling, she walked alongside Jenkins, laying out the essential elements of her plan: her intention to petition for guardianship of all 5 orphans, their continued residence at the schoolhouse, and her hope for maintaining cultural exchange between the communities. To her surprise, Jenkins didn't immediately reject these ideas. Though clearly struggling with aspects of the cultural bridge he acknowledged the practical reality that Riversbend had limited options for the orphans' care. "Truth is," he admitted as they paused at midday, "we lost nearly a third of our settlement to the fever. Those remaining are stretched, thin, just managing their own families. Finding homes for 5 additional children would be nigh impossible without splitting them up." "Which would be devastating after all they've already lost," Abigail pointed out. Jenkins nodded. "I can't speak for the territorial authorities, of course, but as far as the town council is concerned, your guardianship proposal makes practical sense. You've clearly kept them healthy and well taught through extraordinary circumstances." This tentative support for the first part of her plan gave Abigail courage to elaborate on the second, the continued connection with the Lakota community. She emphasized the educational value of cultural exchange, the practical survival skills the children had acquired, and the therapeutic benefit of maintaining relationships that had helped them process their grief. Jenkins listened more skeptically to this portion, but didn't dismiss it outright. "It's unusual," he acknowledged, "but then again, frontier life often requires unusual arrangements. I suppose discreet visits during peaceful times might be manageable, especially with Blackburn's assistance as interpreter." By late afternoon, the familiar outline of Riversbend appeared on the horizon. The settlement looked smaller than Abigail remembered, its buildings clustered defensively against the vast prairie surrounding them. The schoolhouse stood slightly apart, its windows dark, the chimney cold, waiting for their return to transform it back into a home. As they approached the outskirts, Jenkins halted the party. "It might be best if the Lakota remain here while we continue on," he suggested, clearly concerned about the settlement's reaction to native visitors, even peaceful ones. Two Hawks had anticipated this and had already discussed it with Abigail. "We camp here," he confirmed. "Return to our people tomorrow, but first complete our promise to bring you safely home." The compromise allowed the Lakota escort to fulfill their responsibility while avoiding potential friction with the settlement. Blackburn offered to remain with them overnight, serving as both host and buffer with any curious or suspicious settlers who might investigate their presence. Final farewells were exchanged, more restrained than their departure from the winter. Camp, but no less meaningful. Two Hawks presented each child with an eagle feather, a significant honor that marked them as friends of his people. In return, Abigail gave him a formal letter of gratitude that he could show to any officials questioning his band's activities near white settlements. "Until summer berries ripen," Two Hawks said in parting, referencing their planned reunion during the Lakota's berry harvesting season. "Until summer berries ripen," the children echoed, the phrase having become their private promise of continued connection. The short walk from the camp to the settlement's main street felt like crossing between worlds. Abigail was acutely aware of the children's appearance. Their clothing that blended elements from both cultures, their sun-darkened faces, the Lakota-style braids that Emma and Charlotte had adopted. They would present a striking contrast to the settlement's expectations of how blizzard survivors should look. Word of their approach spread quickly through River's Bend. People emerged from buildings, expressions of disbelief giving way to joy as they recognized the returning group. Mrs. Peterson, who had lost her husband to the fever, rushed forward to embrace Emma, whom she had helped teach sewing before the epidemic. Mr. Wilson, the blacksmith who had taken over after Samuel's father died, gripped the boy's shoulder with tears in his eyes. The welcome was genuine, if somewhat bewildered. Settlers struggled to reconcile their relief at seeing the missing schoolteacher and orphans with the visible evidence of their winter among the Sioux. Questions bubbled beneath the surface of every greeting, but frontier courtesy kept them temporarily at bay. Jenkins wisely suggested postponing any formal explanations until the next day. "Miss Winters and the children need rest after their journey," he announced to the gathering crowd. "The council will meet tomorrow, and all will be explained in due course." This directive provided the space Abigail needed to re-establish their home in the schoolhouse. As they entered the familiar one-room structure, memories of their desperate final days before Wichapi's arrival came flooding back. The dwindling firewood, the meager food stores, the howling blizzard that had seemed determined to claim their lives. Yet the children's reaction surprised her. Rather than dwelling on those fearful memories, they moved through the space with newfound confidence, assessing needs and taking initiative. Daniel immediately checked the roof for winter damage, while Samuel examined the stovepipe for blockages. Emma and Charlotte organized their few belongings with practiced efficiency, and even little Grace showed remarkable self-sufficiency as she arranged her sleeping area. "It seems smaller somehow," Emma observed as they worked to make the schoolhouse habitable again. "Everything does after living in the open camp," Daniel agreed, "but it's still home." That simple assertion contained volumes. The schoolhouse was indeed still their home, but they themselves had changed, bringing new perspectives, skills, and connections to this familiar space. They would transform it, just as it would reshape them, creating something that honored both worlds they now inhabited. As twilight descended on River's Bend, Abigail stepped outside to watch the first stars appear. In the distance, barely visible, the smoke from Two Hawks' campfire rose as a thin column against the darkening sky, a physical reminder of the bridge they were beginning to build. Tomorrow would bring challenges, explanations to the town. Council, negotiations about the children's legal status, careful groundwork for their continuing connection with the Lakota community. But tonight, standing on the threshold between their past and future, Abigail felt a profound sense of rightness about the path they had chosen. The great blizzard that had nearly claimed their lives had instead given them an unexpected gift. A broader vision of what family, community, and education could encompass on the American frontier. Their winter of hardship had yielded a spring of possibility, not just for 5 orphaned children and their determined teacher, but perhaps for larger circles of understanding in the territory they all called home. As she turned to go inside, where the children were lighting lamps against the gathering darkness, Abigail remembered Wichapi's parting words. "Eagle stone sees far, like your teacher's heart must do." Touching the carved pendant that hung around her neck, she silently renewed her commitment to that far-seeing vision, a vision of bridges instead of barriers, of knowledge flowing in both directions, of children growing strong because they could draw nourishment from multiple cultural roots. It would not be easy, this path between worlds. But standing in the doorway of the schoolhouse, watching the children who had walked that path through the harshest winter in memory, Abigail knew with certainty that it was a journey worth making, not just for their small family, but for all who might follow the trail they were blazing through the wilderness of cultural division. With that knowledge warming her heart, she stepped inside to join the children in making their house a home once more. A home now large enough to encompass experiences and connections that stretched far beyond its modest walls, into the vast, star-filled Dakota sky that watched over all the territory's children, regardless of birth or background. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.